afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Shoaf, and I'm a senior associate here at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I run our Japan program that is now almost 6 months old. So excited about that and excited to have you here with us today. We have a very good crowd, and I think that's a testament to our speakers and to the topic at hand. Today's event is really a U.S. Japan Research Institute event. It's part of their USJI week. And when I saw the topic for this event advertised, I was very intrigued because it really fits in with a lot of what I hope our Japan program here can address. And so I called up Yasunaga-san and asked if it would be okay to host the event here, and they gratefully accepted. Because this topic really fits in with what we want to do in our Japan program. I believe that we could find more effective ways to leverage the Alliance to be a positive force behind Asia's rise and development, helping to shape the regional architecture in a constructive and inclusive way. And our institute, our endowment, will be launching a project along these lines as well in the coming year. So I thank USJI for working with us on this project, and I wanted to welcome briefly Professor Uchida Katsuichi, who is president of USJI and also vice president of Waseda University. And it's a great honor to have you here with us, Uchida-sensei.
Good afternoon. Welcome to joint seminars of the USJI and also the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace on the topics of the US-Japan role in building an East Asia communities. And this is one of the events of the USJI week. And USJI is the non-profit research organization established in March 2009 by 8 leading Japanese universities like Doshisha, Kyoto, Keio, Kyushu, Ritsumeikan, Tsukuba, Tokyo, and Waseda universities. And we are supported by Japanese corporations and also the foundations in the United States. The purpose of the USJI is to dispatch the policy-related research activities of Japanese universities to show the wider audience in the United States. We have covered many important issues and global issues, both United States and Japan based. And every year we have a USJI week twice a year, usually in March and in September. And this week we have 8 events, and I understand this is the 6th event of this USJI week. We have covered in this week many different topics, such as the food, environment, energy, and disaster resilience, and the future of the Korean Peninsula. And today we're going to discuss this US-Japan role in building an East Asian communities. And tomorrow we'll the title of event 7 is the US pivots to ASEAN, Japan, China, and Korea. The subtitle is How Can New Leaders in Northeast Asia Maintain Regional Peace? And particularly emphasize on maritime security in East Asia and China-Japan problems. That's event 7. That's in the morning of tomorrow. And in the afternoon, we have a seminars on evaluating Japanese growth and reverse strategy. Is Abe inheriting the PJ's policy? And so I would like to welcome viewers not only to this event, but also the event for tomorrow morning and afternoon. And we are very pleased to be able to co-host these programs with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A couple more words of introduction before I introduce our speakers today. There was an interesting article in the current edition of National Interest that caught my attention, entitled "The Mythical Liberal Order" by Nazanin Barma, Eli Ratner, and Steve Weber. The article considers the post-World War II Western-led so-called liberal order and concludes that it's not so much under siege around the world in places like the Middle East and North Korea, but that it never really lived up to its aspiration in the first place, and that its existence is something of a myth, which I stopped and pondered for a little while, and I decided that I disagree with various aspects of their argument. But I think it's useful to challenge some of the assumptions that we have about the post-World War II liberal order, and also keep that in the back of our mind as we turn our attention to East Asia. And as an East Asian community evolves and matures in our lifetime, the roles, I think, of the alliances and of coalitions of countries with shared interests willing to get engaged is going to be extremely vital. And that's a big reason why I think the U.S. Japan Alliance has a key role to play in the emergence of an East Asian community. Today, I expect you'll get more questions than answers on this topic. As I understand it, Professor Oga is still in the early stages of his project, and he's come to Washington to gather information and insights. And so, in a way, you're a part of the early phase of his project. And we'll solicit your input after our speakers present. First, let me introduce our main speaker, Dr. Toru Oga. Oga Sensei is an associate professor of political dynamics analysis at Kyushu University with a focus on international politics and East Asian regionalism. He's the author of discourses on Asian nation, the Asian financial crisis, and rediscovering Asianness. And he's published on open regionalism and as well as Asian civil society and regional solidarity movements. And we're lucky to have two wise and experienced discussants with us today. Jim Kritzstedt on the end of the table, my far left, is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He has a very deep and comprehensive knowledge, not only about the Alliance, but also the region as well, serving in a variety of official capacities on Capitol Hill, the State Department, Defense Department. And also Mike Mochizuki, to his right, whom I'm sure you all know, Japan-U.S. Relations Chair, memory of Gaston Seeger, and Associate Dean at the George Washington University. Previously, Mike directed the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and was a senior fellow at Brookings, has taught at USC and Yale University as well, and a very talented scholar who knows both the region and Japan well. So without further delay, let me turn to Professor Oga to get us started on this discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toru Oga, the Associate Professor in Kyushu University. It is my great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to express my gratitude to USJI and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, especially for Jim Scott, the co-hosting the great opportunities. Here, I have 15 minutes for presentations. So for the first 5 minutes, I introduce the overview of the project, and in the rest of the time, I'm going to proceed my own research presentation. So, okay. In the first place, the project is a study of security community in East Asia. It's international collaboration studies among Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and American scholars. In Japan, I based on the Japanese Association of Political Sociology. We already have 3 different conferences in this series. And the Mike Mochizuki here that joined one of these conferences in the last month, January. It is the first time for me to present this theme in the United States. USJI is a great opportunity for our purpose. Well, the security community is, in definition, a region in which a large scale of use of violence has become very unlikely or even unthinkable. In the contemporary context, it includes the traditional and non-traditional security issues. Well, and this time of the seminar, we have Japanese and American scholars, so we examine the role of U.S. Japan Alliance in the comprehensive security in East Asia. Well, back to the overall project, the traditional and non-traditional security issues include human security, economic security, and energy security in the region, with future prospect of East Asian community and U.S. bilateral relations with Japan, Korea, and China. In other words, we examine traditional and non-traditional security issues on the one hand, and U.S. bilateral relations and East Asian community building on the other. By the same token, we examine how the U.S. bilateral relations influence to the East Asian community and how East Asian community influence to the U.S. bilateral relations. And this seminar focuses on the relationship between U.S. Japan Alliance and East Asian community building. And we have two presenters today. We present the significance of U.S. Japan Alliance from Japan's and U.S. perspective. I present the Japan's view, and James, in the end of the table, will present the U.S. views. In conclusion, we have a discussion on the significance of U.S.-Japan Alliance in making of the East Asian communities. I move to my own presentation. Just one. My own presentation is the U.S.-Japan Alliance and East Asian regionalism from Japan's perspectives. I think there are some misunderstanding or misinterpretations on Japan's perspectives or Japan's policies to East Asia for U.S. observers. For example, when Yukio Hatayama became the prime minister, it's 4 years ago, he showed the very positive views on the East Asian communities. Then many American people observed that Japan leaves from the United States and going back to the Asia. But it is not accurate understandings to the Japanese policy. The America or Asia, or America versus Asia, is a meaningless question for Japanese policymakers. Because for the last 50 or 60 years after the post-war regimes, every Japanese government or every Japanese prime ministers answer the same things. Both United States and East Asia is an indispensable partner for Japan. And Japanese policies for the last 2 decades have demonstrated this. On the one hand, Japan has strengthened the security partnership with the United States in the 1990s and 2000. On the other hand, Japan also joined the process of East Asian communities. Then, the strengthening of U.S. partnership and strengthening East Asian community is not contradictions. Both directions is compatible for Japanese government. The point is how we balance between U.S. partnership and East Asian communities. The other point is that we sometimes distinguish the words between Asia-Pacific and East Asia. If we say East Asia, the community is only limited to Asian countries. But if we say Asia-Pacific, the non-Asian countries, especially United States, would join the communities. So therefore, in terms of regional community buildings, Japan strategically used the East Asian regionalism and Asia-Pacific regionalism. Well, and this is a chronology of Japanese policy development of security and economic regionalism. In the left side, in the late 1990s, Japan and the United States have prepared to enhance the security cooperations. In the right side, in sphere of regionalism, after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, ASEAN Plus 3 is created, and East Asian community building is institutionalized in those years. Well, in 2000, the Japanese government further liberalized for the defense policies and reconstructing the security cooperations with the United States. After the Cold War decades, in the 1990s and 2000, the nature of U.S.-Japan Alliance might be changed from bilateral security relations to regional security community or the regional security frameworks. On the other hand, look on the right side, the East Asian Summit has launched in 2005 with Japanese initiatives. The East Asian Summit has developed with non-Asian members, the ASEAN Plus 3 and Plus 6 and Plus 8. And the ASEAN Plus 3 is ASEAN and China, Japan, and Korea. And Plus 6 includes the India, Australia, and New Zealand. And Plus 8 also includes the United States and Russia. Well, in the 1996, the Japan and the United States make the declaration on the security, and it is symbolizing the Japanese the dual directions. The security cooperation must be include the United States, which means the security community must be Asia Pacific rather than East Asia. And this is a similar logic of open regionalism, which has been emphasized in the APEC. The two include the United States. The regional community must be Asia Pacific rather than East Asia. On the other hand, geographically speaking, Asia Pacific is too broad, but they have different cultures, histories, religions, and languages. So they need to emphasize the common values and interests, such as democracy, human rights, and any other liberal values. Accordingly, in the 1997s, Japan and the United States reviewed the guidelines for Japan-US security cooperation. Also, they released a joint statement in September 1997. Accordingly, the discourses for Japan-US security cooperations have two principal characteristics. The first one is that they emphasize Asia-Pacific security community, not East Asia. And on the other hand, it also emphasizes the common value and interest, such as freedom, democracy, and human rights. In other words, during the Cold War, we don't have to justify the alliance by the liberal words, because in the Cold War, we have a clear enemies, so it is a merely bilateral alliance. But today, the U.S.-Japan Alliance has a big impact on the regional security framework. Therefore, they need to define the regional community, and they need to justify by the common values and interests. Well, I'm back to the Japanese policy practice. In the 2003 and 2004, Japan proceeded numerous defense legislations with response to especially global terrorism and the tensions in the Korean Peninsula. Also in 2003, the United States and Japan made a roadmap for realigning security cooperation and implementations. Also, there are many important incidents in the 2011, 12, and this year. The East Japan earthquake in 2011 and territorial tensions with Korea and China in the last year. And finally, in the last week, the Prime Minister Abe and President Obama had a meeting, and they also reaffirmed the importance of U.S.-Japan Alliance, and a partnership with China and Korea. Well, in conclusion, I have some notes for conceptualization for U.S.-Japan relations and East Asian communities. Firstly, there is a distinction between East Asian regionalism and Asia-Pacific regionalism. The security cooperation prefers the Asia-Pacific regionalism. And secondly, this Asia-Pacific regionalism emphasizes the shared common values and interests. And it is also demonstrated the Aso Taro's public speech in 2007. You know, Aso Taro is a financial minister today, but he was a foreign minister in 2007. And he provided the idea of arc of freedom and prosperity and value diplomacies. The idea is that the making the community that share develop values and common prosperities. So finally, Asia-Pacific regionalism and shared common develop values are the key to understand U.S.-Japan security cooperation, and it might bridge the gap between the United States, their presence in Asia, and East Asian community buildings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to consider there, and I just want to take a quick moment to highlight. I think it would be interesting to explore a little bit today this idea of zero-sum versus plus-sum products in the alliance based on Japan's policy toward East Asia community building that was certainly on display in the Hatoyama era, and now even we think about it as people look at a new administration in South Korea. Will Madam Park, President Park, turn toward China and away from the alliance, or is it really zero-sum, or are there plus-sum strategies here? And this idea of value diplomacy and its compatibility with East Asia community building, and how ASEAN and others in Asia will respond to that kind of quality in the context of alliance outreach and community building. So a couple of questions that came to my mind, but let's turn to Jim Pritzit for some of his thoughts, and we'll build as we go.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to talk a little bit about the elusive East Asian community. 30 years ago...
The microphone on?
Excuse me?
It's on. Maybe just hold a little closer.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. 30 years ago, I was first involved in an early effort to build an Asian Pacific community. I was then on the staff of the subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, chaired by then Congressman Lester Wolf, who was a great entrepreneur, who came up with the idea of a Pan-Pacific community organization. I thought it was quite interesting and appealing, and had some interest across the region. Well, unfortunately, Lester lost an election. We lost our jobs, and the vision did not get very far at that time. 30 years later, where do we stand today? Well, when I look at East Asia, we talk about communities, I see basically 3 East Asian communities. Now, they're not necessarily integrated. In fact, I think they're going in different directions. The first East Asian community is the economic community. This is the hot community. Then there is a warm, fuzzy, multilateral diplomatic community. And finally, there is a cold, bilateral, political, and security community. I'll just keep these in mind and try and walk through them very briefly. Let's start with the economics, the economic community that exists today. Now, it's clear that the region is marked by economic integration and a China-centered production network. China today is the #1 trading partner of Japan, the UK, Australia, ASEAN, across the board. China is the economic driving force in terms of the region. And there are also a number of trade liberalizing or trade promoting efforts that are going on throughout the region. It goes back to APEC to start with, as a unilateral trade liberalizing effort. Subsequently, we've come to witness an evolution of FTAs across the region of various standards. There's the China-ASEAN FTA, the Chorus FTA, the U.S.-Australia FTA, the Japan-Singapore FTA. There is RCEP, there is EEP, and there is TPP. There is the Japan-China ROK trilateral efforts at a FTA. To me, when I look at all of this, the policy challenge somewhere down the road is going to be how do you integrate these various institutions and organizations which are operating on very different standards and very different values. This is going to be a fundamental challenge if you are going to build a real community. Then moving on, there's the warm and fuzzy multilateral diplomatic community. And over the past 30 years, we've seen a proliferation of multilateral organizations and institutions. There's ASEAN, there's the ARF, there's the ARF Senior Officials Meeting, there's the ADDM Plus Defense Ministers Meeting, and the ADDM and then the ADDM Plus. There's the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, there's the EAS, which was pointed out earlier, there's the ASEAN 3, the ASEAN 6, and the ASEAN 8. I mean, we're really at a point where hardly a week goes by without an ASEAN-related meeting across the region. At the highest level, it brings leaders together. Excuse me, I spent 2.5 hours at the dentist today, and I'm still not speaking correctly. I have the extra pills if I need them, but I'm trying to. It brings leaders together to discuss different security issues that affect the region. For example, North Korea, East China Sea, Thai Cambodia. But it doesn't bring leaders together to solve problems. There have been some recognized low-level successes that Jim was part of, I think, when he was at the Pentagon, building multilateral cooperation with respect to humanitarian affairs, disaster relief, medicine, avian flu, that kind of multilateral cooperation that really engages militaries, senior leaders at this level. But when it comes to efforts to establish a code of conduct in the South China Sea, we really are a very long way from a rules-based order necessary for the development of an East Asian community. And looking at efforts over the past couple of years, I'm not expecting great progress in this area down the road. And this brings us finally to the third community. This is the cold bilateral political and security community, marked by unresolved territorial issues, Japan, China, Senkaku's Diaoyutai, Japan, Korea, Takashima, Dokdo, Japan, Russia, the Northern Territories, the ROK in China, some submerged reef. There's Taiwan that still exists as a fundamental political problem, Thai-Cambodian border, the North Korean nuclear issue. There are a host of security issues that are out there, political security issues that really affect the evolution of a political community. And then on top of that, we have the issue that everyone here recognizes as history. To my mind, Frank Fukuyama was wrong. History never ended. It's alive and well in East Asia, and I think it has a very long life ahead, judging from the reactions that we've seen over the past couple of years. And I think this political community is also marked by unstated but very real efforts to define the nature of the regional community. The regional order. Is it going to be a China-centric order, or is it going to be a rules-based international order? I think the point made, I think it was very important, Foreign Minister Anto's speech, the arc of freedom and prosperity, I think was a clear challenge to Chinese visions of order in the region to set out a democratic, open order that would support a real East Asian community. So these are the political and security problems that exist at a bilateral that continue to make, to my mind, the formation of a real community exceedingly difficult. Now, so where does that bring us to today? How does this affect the U.S.-Japan efforts to build, to support the East Asian community? Well, during his visit to Washington last week, Prime Minister Abe set out 3 tasks for Japan. The first, to serve as a leading promoter of rules-based order. The second, to serve as a guardian of the global commons, in particular the maritime commons, on which so much of the world's prosperity depends. And finally, to enhance cooperation with the United States, the ROK, Australia, other democracies. I believe these objectives should be joint goals of the alliance, and that to the extent that we can cooperate across the board in these various areas, we can really help to build a stable and secure East Asian community. I'll stop here. Mike?
That's great. Let me turn it over to Mike right away before I'll interject. I'll add some comments later, because I keep coming back to this issue of interest, which Professor Olga raised, and the idea of plus-sum, zero-sum approaches, interests and values, and can you, and how that connects to the three categories in a sense that Jim was talking about. It's probably the easiest to overcome that in the economic, financial realm, and then harder as you move into some of the other categories. But Mike, let me give you the tough task of adding to all of this discussion that's gone on.
Yes, thank you very much, Jim. I was worried that if I went last, I wouldn't have anything to add, because I would agree with all the previous speakers, and I think that's largely true. But you know, since I think both Professor Olga and Jim have probably emphasized the positive sum aspect in U.S.-Japan relations regarding community building, although I very much agree how elusive having a real East Asian security community is. I think what I want to emphasize is maybe kind of some of the tensions that might exist between the United States and Japan. You know, Professor Olga is very polite, but he referred to a meeting that I participated in Tokyo in January, and it was a panel precisely on this, and there were 5 panelists. One was a prominent political scientist from Japan. Another was a former foreign ministry high official who served inside the Prime Minister's office during the Hatayama administration. Another was a former finance ministry high official who was one of the architects of Japan's regional financial policy. And then was one of 2 Americans. The other was an official from the U.S. Embassy. And I was put in a surprising position of having to defend U.S. policy when usually I tend to be quite critical. And the Japanese participants were not as polite as Professor Olga, and they were quite scathing in terms of their criticism, in terms of how obstructionist the United States is regarding Japan's policy towards Asia. And I had to disagree, but acknowledge that there was an element of truth. And maybe I should start by the way Hatayama's view of the East Asian community was viewed in Washington, and Professor Olga kind of politely disagreed with the American take on this. But you know, I think if you read Jeffrey Bader's excellent book on Wama and China's rise, there is a very telling passage, a couple of pages, of his assessment of Prime Minister Hatayama's East Asian community idea. And he says that he was shocked that the leader of our most important ally in Asia would be embracing an idea that was very similar to Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia's idea of an East Asian economic caucus, a vision that would exclude the United States from Asia. I met with Prime Minister Hatayama soon after the book came out, and I said, well, you know, is this true? And he emphatically said no, but I didn't necessarily believe him, so I did some research. And I went through all of his public statements about this, and it's interesting. One of his first press conferences after he became Prime Minister, on September 16, 2009, he was asked about the East Asian community. And he says, this idea certainly is not intended to exclude the US dollar or the United States. Quite the contrary, as a step beyond this initiative, I believe we should envisage and Asia-Pacific community, as Professor Olga mentioned, and I do not think that this could readily be achieved without the United States. This was an early press conference, and then a little bit more than a week later, he comes to the United Nations and gives a General Assembly speech, and he makes a reference to the East Asia community, and he emphasizes the principle of open regionalism. In October 2009, the time when Jeff Bader mentions that Hatayama is pursuing kind of a Mahathir type idea, Prime Minister Hatayama, while he is in Southeast Asia, says that the idea is not exclusive and states that the United States would be a member of this. And then in his major speech about the East Asian community idea, he starts out the speech in Singapore with the point that the United States and the alliance is the linchpin of Japan's foreign policy. And then he talks about bridging Asia and his support for the ASEAN +6 idea and the expansive free trade area for the Asia Pacific. So the only place where I could see that an official of the Hatayama government would talk about the exclusion of the United States was when Foreign Minister Okada talked about an East Asian summit process that was basically the ASEAN +3. And then he said the United States would not be a part of this. Now, Mr. Hatayama is too much of a nice guy to be prime minister, and he basically did not rail in his rogue foreign minister. But the other thing is that Foreign Minister Okada was basically saying the same thing that Prime Minister Koizumi had said when he had been prime minister. And there was not much concern then, precisely because Mr. Koizumi was doing what he could to buttress the U.S. Japan Alliance. Now, I go through this because when I look at the historical record, the United States has generally tended to be ambivalent. Despite the efforts of Jim on Capitol Hill, ambivalent about regionalism in Asia, and it's in marked contrast to the U.S. approach in Europe, that fostering a European community was front and center, a part of U.S. strategic policy. But it was not the case in terms of East Asia. Now, when one looks at the diplomatic record from the 1950s, Japan, as an agent, as a country that is trying to find degrees of freedom, probes the outer boundaries of the Cold War divide and tries to transgress it, but the United States pulls Japan in, and the formula that Japan kind of begins to develop is to separate economics and politics. So preserve the U.S. kind of Cold War divide in Asia, but permeate that boundary through economic relations. And even on the economic front, it's kind of amazing that, for example, Japan early on was supporting the creation of the Asia Development Bank, but initially the United States resisted this. It was Japan and Prime Minister Ohita that promoted the notion of a Pacific Basin concept. When Japan talks about cooperative security, and this was an idea that the Brookings Institution promoted soon after the end of the Cold War, when that notion of a cooperative security idea emerges in the Higuchi report, it is criticized frontally by two very good friends of mine here in Washington, D.C. So I would think it would be great if the United States and Japan could work together for the construction of an East Asian community, but unfortunately, there is a great deal of ambivalence and suspicion And although it's ultimately positive sum, I think there's kind of a negative sum aspect to it. Nevertheless, what's striking to me is despite the mythology of Japan being a reactive state, I find it incredible how much Japan seizes opportunities to promote Asian regionalism despite the resistance from the United States. And they do it, and they have been doing it by leading from behind. And in many ways, it's a response to policies that they disagree with by the United States, or they're concerned about the United States. For example, Japan was concerned about the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as the formation of the European Union, because Japan would be hurt by this kind of regionalization. And so out of that, Japan developed the notion of that finally became APEC, to prevent the divide in the Pacific, but deferred to Australia to promote the idea. When the United States looked like it was pulling back militarily from Asia after the end of the Cold War, and at the same time the United States was pressuring Japan to be a more proactive security player, Japan's response was to promote security dialogues for the region, which was initially resisted by the United States, but later becomes the ASEAN Regional Forum. After the Japanese were concerned about the U.S. policy towards the East Asian financial crisis, it was Japan that worked with other Asian countries, and you see the emergence of the ASEAN +3. So despite Foreign Minister and now Finance Minister Aso's talk about this arc of freedom, I mean, it's great bumper sticker. But in the end, when you look at actual policy, Japan has promoted regionalism, and it has tended to do it from behind, and to the extent that it's kind of framed it, it has been an ASEAN-centered regional approach. Finally, Jim had covered a lot of what I want to say about economics, political, and the security side. Just on the security side, there's no question that we're moving towards what I would call a soft multilateralization of the U.S. Alliance network, and I think that's a good thing, and it resonates with Prime Minister Abe's notion of the diamond, U.S. Australia, U.S. Japan, Japan India, Japan Australia. So greater security cooperation among these four. I was delighted that during the CSIS speech, Abe also included Korea in the mix, and then there's also Japan promoting capacity building in Southeast Asia. But the key question then is, what do you do about China? How do you bring China in? And part of this can be done bilaterally. The United States does it through the strategic and economic dialogue. I hope that eventually we'll return to summits between Japan and China. Now, we have the East Asian Summit, which is all-inclusive, and China is a part of it. But China had preferred a 10+6 process, not the 10, or the 10+3, and not the 10+8 that we now have with the East Asian Summit. And so this is not going to give a lot of reassurance to the Chinese. And it seems to me that hopefully the time will come when we can have a trilateral kind of U.S., Japan, China dialogue, and continue to develop the Japan ROK China. And when you look at the Japan ROK China, what's really surprising is how much the dialogue has moved in terms of non-traditional security issues. Certainly it can't resolve the difficult territorial issues, but I think all three countries see the need for greater security cooperation. Now finally, I'll end with the relationship between the economics and the politics. And you know, one of the things that's most surprising to me has been how in this latest crisis in Sino-Japanese relations, the Japanese business community, except for maybe one or two business leaders, have been pretty quiet about the deterioration in Sino-Japanese relations. I would have expected that the Japanese business community, for economic reasons, would be up in front to talk about the importance of stabilizing the Sino-Japanese relations shift. You know, one of my good friends from Japan answered the puzzle for me. And it was that despite the deterioration in Sino-Japanese relations, political relations, and acknowledging that there has been a decline in trade between China and Japan, that the economic relationship between these two countries are surprisingly good. And he expects investments to continue to increase. And so what we now may be seeing is that it's not just that we have kind of hot economics and cold politics and security, but the insulation of the economic side of things, despite the deterioration of political security relations. And so then the big question for me is how long can this insulation survive, but also to what extent that the warmth of the economic side can eventually spill over to the security dimension. So finally, you know, I think when we look back at the first couple years of the Obama administration and the tensions in U.S.-Japan relations, and when we were concerned that Japan was maybe tilting towards China, which I don't think it was, maybe if it would serve America's interest if there was a little bit more community building in East Asia, and then we wouldn't have these ridiculous territorial disputes, and we could move forward in terms of historical reconciliation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike and Jim. Those are very interesting and useful comments. Before I add a couple of thoughts of my own and we open it up to Q&A and discussion, I wanted to give everybody a chance to, if you had any thoughts or reactions to some of the comments that Mike and Jim made. If you do.
Mike and Jim.
Yeah, or additional thoughts if you wanted to.
I think it's good for asking the
Questions. Okay. No, that's fine. One thought that occurred to me, Mike, I totally agree in terms of some of the historical issues that you brought up in terms of efforts, fits and starts of community building and regionalism in East Asia. I guess one question I have to start out is, it always made sense to me that there was a place for regionalism or an East Asian community that had the U.S. as a part of it, and also a place for community building that did not have the U.S. as a part of it. It made perfect sense that both would be in existence and could be compatible, but I also understand why the United States was suspicious at times of Japan's initiatives in this regard. Primarily, if I go back to the issue of interests and values, 20 years ago, interests and values were not quite as tight, perhaps, as they are today. Certainly, economic interests, we saw ourselves in a more competitive position vis-a-vis Japan, and we were coming off the trade tensions and that kind of relationship. And I think we viewed Japan's efforts in East Asia, or some of its foreign policies, as more mercantilistic than we would have, with our emphasis on human rights and democracy building and putting that first and foremost, whereas I think Japan had that second, in some cases. But I wonder if that still holds true today. I mean, I would feel very comfortable of an East Asian community without the United States that had a strong voice for Japan, because I believe our interests and values so closely aligned even more now. And you have a more capable and vocal South Korea in the mix that has, again, not identical, but more similar interests and values in this context. And so that the Asian community that, without the United States, that could emerge now in some ways, and some of the Southeast Asian countries, might make the United States feel more comfortable about not getting in the way of that. So that was one thought that popped into my head. And another question I'd like to throw out before we open it up more broadly is the role of institutions. And as I was listening to our panelists talk, can we have community building? Can community building be effective without institutions? I don't know if that's a kind of an old way of thinking that we need institutions. And if so, right now we've got a lot of frameworks, not necessarily institutions in the sense that they have buildings and headquarters and permanent staff and this and that. We have a ton of different frameworks, and I wonder how much emphasis should we put on trying to transition some of those frameworks into institutions, or is that a wasted effort? And I don't know if Professor Olga or if either of our discussants have any thoughts about one or two of those questions or comments.
Well, just very quickly on your 2 points. Yeah, I certainly think that there is some convergence between the United States and Japan, either on economics, on kind of democratic values. But still, I think there's a gap. For example, in terms of democracy promotion or the relationship between the state and the economy, I think it's not that Japan has become like the United States, but it's just that Japan is less of a competitor. And that's why there isn't the friction. But when I look at Japanese policy, it hasn't converged with the United States, and the ROK, too, there has been convergence, but it's partial convergence. And then when you look at Southeast Asia, I don't see. I see a big gap between the United States and those countries. And your question about institutions, that's a great one. But I think the Asian experiment is to think about regionalism without kind of the legalistic perspective that we have in Europe. I see it as kind of a network, organic type of regionalism. And on the economic side, it's really the bottom-up process, which I think that has been the most critical. The kind of the formalization at the top is not as important as kind of the bottom-up proliferation of regional production networks.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with that, as it really has been bottom-up, that has driven the economic dimension of this. I think it's been formalized through a lot of these institutions and organizations that really at its core has been driven by business.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on one point that Mike made that I thought is when he talked about the installation of the Japan-China economic relationship. I think that's very accurate. I think it is the foundation of that relationship that really provides kind of a floor for which the elevator can't go any further, but it can't crash. I think it's very similar to the relationship we have with China, where the economic relationship really has held this relationship together through some very, very difficult times. I remember I was on the planning staff of the State Department at Tiananmen, and at the political level, the relationship just crashed. But the relationship kept moving forward because of the business ties that were so profoundly strong. And when I think about it, put it in the context of skyscrapers, in terms of the U.S. Japan and the U.S. China relationship, the the foundation, the economic foundation is very strong, and it kind of supports the relationship. The elevator can go up or down, but it's not going to go through it's not going to crash through the foundation. It's going to stabilize the relationship on almost every instance. There's a difference about how high the elevator can go in terms of progress in developing relations. And I think because of the difference in values between the U.S. and China and the similarity of values of the U.S. and Japan, there's a certain limit as to on 100 stories, how high up the elevator can go in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. And there's there's a greater opportunity for growth in the U.S.-Japan relationship because of that very similar sharing of values.
I think I want to take the stairs with this elevator crashing.
Okay, and my point out the Hatoyama and East Asian communities, but I think almost all prime ministers of Japan argued the balance between Asia and the United States, and Koizumi also emphasized the ASEAN plus 3 and the East Asian communities. So I think the difference among Koizumi, Aso, and Hatoyama is not substantial difference. They just provide the different emphasis to the regional communities. And also, I don't think Japan promoted the policies on regionalism, or Japan promoted ASEAN-centered regionalism, because I think the answer is East Asia Summit. In the East Asia Summit, Japan proposed to include the non-Asian members, like ASEAN plus 6 and ASEAN plus 8. Yeah, so I think Japan does not necessarily promote the policies on regionalism.
Well, we have a good half hour for questions and answers, and I'll call on people. I ask if you can identify yourself and wait for a microphone, or in reverse order.
Ellen Frost with the East-West Center at the National Defense University. Thank you for taking my question. Mike, I have a rather different perspective, I think, on U.S. policy towards regional agreements in Asia that exclude the United States. It's a much more positive one, and I'd like to present it for your comment. The United States began wrestling with this right after World War II in the case of Europe. And since then, I would argue that our policy has been benign and positive with some provisos. Provisos such as not imposed against the will, i.e. Soviet Union, not designed to undermine an alliance or international institution, blah, blah, designed to promote trade, not restrict it, and so forth. I think and I would further argue that even in today's context, the U.S. government has been more positive than I think you give it credit for. Certainly the Treasury Department has strongly supported Chiang Mai and all the CMI stuff. We took a series of initiatives that you know about that I think were designed to signal our support for Asian regionalism. I think what you may be thinking of is that there was some concern that China was marginalizing Japan in the non-financial ASEAN plus 3 context, and also that the RCEP and some of these bilateral FTAs were very, very low standard agreements by the terms that we expect, in our own agreements. But I don't think that amounts to an overall negative attitude. I would argue it's actually the contrary. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah, well, I mean, in many ways, what you're reflecting is my defense of U.S. policy when in Japan, and it's definitely not as negative as I characterized it today. I was kind of sharpening the lines of debate, but in certain areas, there are initial periods of resistance. And then I think the United States really comes to embrace it. And it's not as if the United States is often kind of embrace the Japanese initiatives at the very beginning. So I see it as more ambivalence, and then Japan pursuing for example, after the East Asian financial crisis, the United States came down very hard on Japan, and then the Japanese were flabbergasted that Bill Clinton was in China with the Chinese, criticizing Japan and in a sense blaming Japan for what had happened and praising China. And that really rubbed the Japanese the wrong way. And then the Japanese worked quietly to work with China to change the Chinese view. And then eventually we had the Chiang Mai Initiative. Now later on, the United States may have embraced it, but you know, in the end, I think America gets comfortable with this. But I think there are many cases in when there's kind of initial ambivalence or even resistance.
Do you have other questions?
Hi, my name is Joelle. There's a mic. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joelle Metcalf from the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies at Waseda University. I have an Article 9 question, but bear with me. So when I think of security communities, one of the things that comes to mind, especially with Europe, is collective self-defense. So because Japan, by Article 9, cannot participate in collective self-defense, it seems like obviously a traditional security integration might not be on the table. However, supposing that the revision allows for collective self-defense, would Japan be likely to start an arrangement for cooperative security? And so if Japan does revise the article, I mean, it could be taken one way or another, but if conducted well, if portrayed as we want to participate in a collective security community to keep the security of the Asia Pacific, do you think that that would be something that would be possible? Because that would be good for the United States, but it would be good for the security of Asia as well.
Is there anyone in particular you wanted to direct that?
No, if anybody wants to answer that one.
Okay. Well, Jim, do you want to clarify there's one piece to clarify, I think, which is that Japan reserves the right, it acknowledges that it has the right to collective self-defense, but it interprets, its current interpretation is that it's not able to exercise that right. My understanding is it believes it is possible to change that interpretation without necessarily revising the Constitution or Article 9, but although a revision would make it even more clear, but still that's a very pertinent question in the context of the current debate about whether or not to change that interpretation. Jim, do you want to?
I was just going to say, really, to my mind, it really depends on how it is packaged. To me, that's fundamental. I think it certainly opens the door to greater U.S. Japan security cooperation, and I think that's a good thing across the board in terms of building regional stability and security. At the same time, when you look at what's happened in terms of the Japan-China relationship and the changing views that the Chinese have had about the security problems. I think if you go back during the Cold War, they weren't thrilled about it, but it was accepted as a way of controlling Japan's remilitarization. They could live with that. But then I'd say if you look from the period 2000-2005, as the U.S. and Japan moved towards greater security cooperation, the Japanese deployed in terms of support for Iraqi freedom. Koizumi making a speech at the Defense Academy saying, well, if we don't support our ally when it needs our help, we can't expect them to support us when we need it in terms of North Korea eventually. And the Chinese watched that, and I think we started to see a change in the way the Chinese analysts looked at the alliance. They saw it as moving away from constraining Japan as towards containing China. So I think in this context, it really depends on how, the diplomatic groundwork, and I think it would take an awful lot of state work to make this one happen, right, anywhere in the immediate future.
Yeah, well, I've confused many Japanese friends because I'm kind of known to be dovish and pretty reluctant to use military force, and I've been for a dramatic reduction of the Marine Corps from Okinawa. But I've always been for the reinterpretation of Article 9 so that Japan can exercise its right. To exercise the right, to not exercise the right that they have seems to be kind of a silly interpretation. And unfortunately, Japan has made this into such a big deal, and that's why it might create these public relations problems. But every member of the United Nations has that right. China has that right. Why can China complain about it? It's enshrined in the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, so it's really a no-brainer issue. And my dovish friends in Japan say, well, if Japan reinterprets the Constitution this way, doesn't that mean that any time the United States asks Japan to use force with the United States, we have to do that? And I said, no, Japan as a sovereign state can still say no to the United States. It's just that you can't use the excuse of the Constitution to say no, and that's what makes the alliance so unhealthy. And I can imagine a case in which China may need the help of Japan. I mean, a Chinese ship may have some problems with the piracy attack. Japan should be able to help if it chose to do so from policy. So I just think it's a no-brainer, but it's unfortunate that in Japanese discourse it's become such a big deal.
I'll just add briefly, because there's a part of your question that suggests this idea that if that restriction is lifted, then that opens the door to some kind of regional security cooperation that heretofore does not exist. And I wouldn't see a direct connection in that regard. Just working in the Defense Department on minilateral and multilateral security cooperation initiatives, we tend to do a lot of work in the humanitarian assistance disaster relief field, especially disaster relief, where the role of the military can be significant. And it's a fairly sensitive way. It's an acceptable way to get militaries together to work together in capacity building, confidence building, and also develop standard operating procedures for working in multilateral coalitions. But even in the disaster relief field, one of the things they tried to negotiate in the ASEAN and ARF forums is a rapid response agreement, or some kind of pre-approved terms under which foreign countries could introduce military personnel. It's kind of like a status of forces agreement, but it's a temporary status of forces agreement, but they try to stay away from that terminology because that was so sensitive. But it was really just to say, okay, if soldiers are coming in to help deliver aid and this and that, there are some basic rules that protect them legally, and there's some obligations and rights that go both ways. They could agree roughly on a template or an outline of what that would look like, so that would not be anything that would hold up a multilateral response to a major disaster in a member country. But they still have not been able to approve that. There's great sensitivity there. So the idea that somehow they'd be able to take another step even beyond, some kind of actual coordinated regional combat role, I think is a long way away. And the closest we'll get is this idea of coalitions of the willing to participate perhaps in certain kind of police-related or maintenance of public order-related activities, primarily in the maritime domain, so counter-piracy and to some extent non-proliferation or that realm, and that'll be about as far as we go. But I too would still be certainly a big supporter of reinterpretation for Japan's participation in peacekeeping operations and for missile defense purposes and others. But would you like to?
Yeah, I basically agree with Jim, but I think the collective security framework, the regional security framework, does not necessarily have to include the collective securities. For example, in the case of ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, they don't assume the collective securities. They have a meeting and they are adjusting the regional collective regional security conflict, but it doesn't include the collective securities. So I think even in the present Article 9 conditions, it's possible for Japan to cooperate like ARF type security communities.
Yes, sir. Coming behind you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the discussion, particularly the points made by Professor.
Can you let us identify yourself?
I am Professor K.V. Kesavan from India, and presently I am attached to Wilson Center. I really enjoyed the discussion on this very important topic. In particular, I would like to mention the points made by Professor Mochizaki. He rightly pointed out that the currency crisis was a turning point in the trading. I think that was the time when Japan really wanted to take an important initiative. They talked about the need for establishing the Asian Monetary Fund, etc. But I think Japan was discouraged by the United States from going ahead with all those initiatives. In fact, that was a turning point in the sense many Japanese felt that the USA has really let them down. For example, I think Mike really referred to the policies pursued by President Clinton, the passing of Japan, etc., etc. Later, of course, we have long years of poisoning, about 6 years. And in my opinion, I think even his policy towards the Asian community was really very faulty. In the sense that he totally neglected the Asian countries, and he thought that to have a robust relationship with USA was just enough to take care of Japan's relationship with Asian countries. Therefore, I think those 6 years were really, in my opinion, were really wasted in terms of building up the community in Asia. Just look back again. For example, Japanese Prime Minister Mori, for example, he talked about, he went to India and talked about the need for building a global partnership with India. Why? Why do you want to have a global partnership with India, particularly 2 years after India had really conducted nuclear tests? For 3 long years, from 1998 until 2001, virtually there was no relationship between India and Japan. But suddenly Modi goes and then talks about the need for building a global partnership with India. Therefore, I think that whenever there is no balance between U.S. alliance and then relations with Asia, I think the community cost will suffered a lot. I think as long as Japan maintained a real balance between its alliance with USA, relations and relations with Asia, I think it was really respected in Asian countries. Now, I would also like to refer to the question of Myanmar, for example. See, for a long time, Japan was having very close relations with Myanmar. Even today, Japan is regarded as one of the friends of Myanmar. But why suddenly Japan stopped its relations with Myanmar? Due to pressure from the United States. But then all of a sudden, US have changed its policy towards Myanmar, and now it's encouraging Japan to go there in a big way. And that is what is happening. In fact, Japan was really interested in integrating Myanmar with ASEAN affairs. It was only United States which really stood in the way of that. Therefore, I think alliance has got something to do with the kind of relations that Japan has always had with Asian countries.
Interesting. So you would say that that Japan is essentially being, its policy toward the region is being strongly influenced by the alliance with the United States in terms of.
Yes.
But I don't know if our panel has thoughts about that. Certainly on the Myanmar case, I think there's some element of what you're talking about there, but they also had the incident of, I think there was the killing of a Japanese journalist by Myanmar armed forces, and a variety of other human rights concerns that that Japan had on their own. But does the panel have any thoughts there, or shall we move to? Thank you for your comment. We'll factor that in. Yeah.
Chris Reeser with Gallup Polling. Is the Trans-Pacific Partnership viewed as part of this East Asian or Pacific community or regionalism, or is it viewed as something separate from that?
Well, I think to the extent that it can be effective, it would certainly serve to enhance regional economic cooperation. That's the way I look at it. This is something that really promotes regional integration at a very high standard. It's difficult because there are other countries, that don't meet those standards at the time. But you got to start somewhere. And to me, this is a way of really drawing together economic cooperation.
According to my framework, the distinction between East Asian regionalism and Asia Pacific regionalism, I think TPP is like APEC. I mean, the TPP and APEC is the Asia Pacific region. They're not very different from East Asian region like ASEAN +3 and East Asia Summit.
I think that's important. Again, conceptually, how you think about it, it's trans-Pacific. When we've thought about it, strategically from a U.S. perspective, we want to see the U.S. as being defined as part of the region, and that's why trans-Pacific is really important to my mind. That's a strategic interest that we have, and I think that very much shapes our thinking. It very much shaped our thinking with regard to APEC versus the East Asian Economic Caucus. I was on the planning staff at the State Department at the time, and when we saw Mahathir come up with that, we said, wow, this is not where we want to go. We opposed it because it was it worked to exclude the United States from the region. That we did not think was in our interest. And of course, the Australians stole it from us.
Now, there are some in Japan who would argue that beyond a trade and economic rationale for participating in TPP, there is a strategic rationale in the context of strengthening alliance relationships, but relationships among countries that are willing to go to that gold standard, which noticeably does not include China at this point in time. I mean, is it possible that heat or hot economic community building, whether it's Asia Pacific or not, could actually undermine strategic or security relations because it makes China feel more vulnerable or excluded, or does it run at cross purposes, or should we view it as completely separate? It's a trade agreement, it has nothing to do with strategic concerns.
Well, there are many trade and investment liberalization processes going on in TPP. I'm a great fan of TPP. It's such a high standard. I think this will be a major test for Japan, and whether in fact there has been a greater convergence between the Japanese and U.S. economy. But the degree of resistance in Japan shows how much more structural reform there's necessary. But I think we should also remember that there's another process that's in the works, is the Japan-China-Korea FTA. The studies for that have concluded, and they may begin to start. It's a low standard, but there may be kind of early benefits for the Japanese, and I wouldn't be surprised if that process moves much more quickly. And gets the deal gets signed before the TPP, and so in that sense, it's not like China is being excluded from these trade liberalization processes.
And Koreans are very much the same, right?
Thank you very much. My name is Hiro Kawauchi at the World Bank. I think that the East Asian community discussed today is obviously different from the European version of the community. That is the alternate version of the regional integration with single currency or the single central banks or the collective defense framework and complete trade liberalization. So I want to ask the panelists whether it worth seeking such kind of ultimate regional integration among the Asian countries, or the Asian countries are fundamentally different from the European countries, so it is better to seek some different direction of the integration. Thank you.
I think this is the point that Jim raised, the institutionalized question. And my answer is the same as my contribution. The East Asian region doesn't have to be too much institutionalized. compared with the European Union. So I think the ASEAN types or East Asia Summit types, the regionalism becomes very different from the European types of integration.
Right here.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I'd like to ask a question or a comment which is a little in contradiction to the other questions or other aspects which wants to keep Japan, as I call it, in American clutches. I'd like to ask this. Isn't it better for Japan to, I know that Europe is not going to be liberated that soon from the American clutches, but Japan has more possibility of doing that. And wouldn't Japan be far more credible in world politics and in affairs dealing with other countries if it did not need the protection of its erstwhile enemy, who who had no compassion at all, dropped 2 nuclear bombs right smack in the middle of 2 cities, and then it talks about human rights. All over the world, the United States goes around talking about human rights, but we know from its records of the last 12 years and the past history of the United States that human rights does not figure in the actions of the U.S. President and the U.S. military. Given that, wouldn't it be better?
Who would like to address? I mean, I'll give you a minute to think about it. I personally, I see great mutual benefit in the alliance, and I don't think it would be sustained as it has been and has flourished if it didn't deliver value to both parties. And
the economic benefits are there. I mean, there's no denying.
But I think political and strategic, I think it's been beneficial for the region as well. But
Even
so we
China benefited from this economic relationship, which was also a former enemy.
And I would certainly agree that I would not single out the United States, I guess, for elements of hypocrisy or transgressions throughout the past. But looking forward, it's a worthwhile question to think what. Forgetting up until now and this and that, looking forward, does Japan still have a lot to gain? Does the region still have much to gain, or if so, what from the alliance as a part or as a vehicle in the process of developing this both East Asian and Asia Pacific community?
Well, just to comment briefly on that, it's that it seems the reaction, almost whenever I go out and talk with people in the region, that it's very clear that the alliance is that they see the alliance as the foundation of stability and security across the region. And I think that's the reality. It has really served as the foundation of the region's prosperity over the last 50 years, and it should continue to do so.
Do we have time for another question or two?
Hello, my name is In-Young Park. I'm a graduate student from South Korea. I wanted to ask the panelists if you believe that resolution of territorial and historical disputes in the region is conditional to building this security framework or community in the region, or the issues would eventually be sidelined because of such strong economic integration. Thank you.
Professor Oga, and Mike, in your seminar workshop that you talked about, that also involved the participation of people from South Korea and China as well, or just your did that subject come up at all? Kind of the issue of
The territorial.
Disputes, or was that kind of conveniently?
It wasn't discussed, but definitely when I was in Japan in January, everyone was talking about the territorial disputes. And the thing about territorial disputes is, unless you can really split the territory and you give half of it to one side and the other half to the other, it's very hard to reach a compromise solution on this. Especially, it is a zero-sum question, and so I think the only way to deal with these territorial disputes is to depoliticize this, to make it less and less important. And one way of doing this is to promote a joint economic development around the seas. If you're thinking about these territorial disputes, especially between Japan and Korea and Japan and China, the amount of real estate is negligible. I mean, it's really the resources around them. And so if you could deal with the political problems, then I think the territorial disputes might disappear. Now, the other thing is that there are symbolic importance, and this is especially between Japan and Korea. And this is why I think it's really important to promote the process of historical reconciliation. And I guess one of the big regrets I have about the DPJ government is that the DPJ, much more than the LDP, would have been the party to promote the reconciliation process. And I think Prime Minister Hatoyama and Prime Minister Kan were quite committed to this. Unfortunately, there were those within the DPJ that resisted, and then we had these unfortunate incidents. And I don't know whether we can return to that time for a while. I mean, I hope that precisely because Prime Minister Abe is seen as a nationalist, he might have the freedom of maneuver to promote historical reconciliation. But as you know, his views tend to be much more nationalistic on these issues than Hatoyama or Kan.
Can I briefly talk to the historical dispute?
Sure.
Yeah. I don't think historical disputes necessarily matter to the security cooperation. For example, even in the United States and Japan, there is a different understanding and kind of dispute to the atomic bombs. I don't know exactly, but some of the American people has the positive views on atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And even if we have a different understanding to the war and atomic bombs, the security cooperation is possible.
Interesting. I guess I'll close in a sense with a story. I would believe that the community building is a means toward the end of reconciling some of those issues. When I was in Tokyo in September and the territorial issues were running hot, NHK had this interesting program where they focused a whole hour and they split it between the Senkakus and then the Tokyo Takashima issue half and half. And on the Senkaku piece, they had a panel of Japanese experts and political commentators from different political persuasions, and they debated and discussed the issue. But for the dispute with Korea, they actually brought onto the show 3 Korean scholars / officials. One I think was from Foreign Ministry, another was a scholar, one was a retired Foreign Ministry. And they debated on live TV in Japanese on the issue on the historical issue and the origin of it and the different arguments of, and it was you could just see the atmosphere in the room between and the tone of the conversation. It was completely different. And so all the millions of people around Japan who were watching that show had a very different impression, and I think a deeper appreciation or an understanding, even if they didn't agree with everything that the Korean gentlemen were saying. The respect for their coming and talking in Japanese and doing this, and that their ability to do that, it's language training, it's familiarity with the country, it's getting to know each other, it's having those networks of being able to bring people onto the shows and the programs. I mean, that's all part of community building in a sense. It's not necessarily financial or trade, and it's not necessarily security, etc. But that's my one little anecdote in terms of how that could potentially help help serve down the line of promoting that. Well, we've come to the end, and I just want to really thank Professor Olga for coming and bringing us this presentation and this project idea and fabulous commentary from Jim and Mike, and for your participation and USJI's collaboration on this as well, and to our staff for putting this all together. Thank you very much for coming.